It's Tuesday, May 11th, 2021, at 4:30 a.m., and Athens police receive a distressing call. It's a nervous adult male, stammering and struggling to articulate his words. Although he's difficult to understand, the police manage to gather that he's been the victim of a robbery. He provides his address, asks for help, and repeatedly insists that his wife may be injured. Several patrols quickly cordoned off the area and kicked down the door. The scene inside matched the typical aftermath of a burglary: drawers pulled open, belongings scattered across the floor, and cameras turned upside down. However, something didn't quite add up. His wife had been murdered, and the manner of her death raised numerous red flags. This is where the intriguing case of Caroline Louise Crouch began. Born on July 12, 2001, in the United Kingdom to Susan de la Cuesta and David Crouch, who were of Filipino and British descent, respectively, Caroline's early life seemed idyllic. David, a member of the armed forces, eventually left his post to work for an international oil company shortly after Caroline's birth. When she was just 2 years old, the family relocated to Athens, Greece, and later, when Caroline was 8, they settled on the island of Eleusis. It was here that her life flourished. She had a younger sister, excelled in school, and made countless friends. Described as intelligent, charismatic, and athletic, Caroline had a passion for sports and joined various extracurricular activities. As she grew older, her talents became even more apparent. She was involved in the Scouts, took up diving, and continued making new friends. By her teenage years, she had joined the Hammerhead Kickboxing Club and even participated in school theatre productions, where she always managed to stand out, whether in a leading role or as part of the supporting cast. At 18, Caroline dropped out of high school and enrolled in statistics at the University of Piraeus. However, before she officially began her university studies, she met someone who would turn her world upside down: Babis Anagnostopoulos, a man 12 years her senior. It was the summer of 2017, and Caroline was about to turn 16. Like most teens, she spent her time hanging out with friends, going to the beach, and enjoying carefree days. During one of these outings, she was introduced to Babis, who was then 29 years old. The official story is that they initially admired each other as friends, but the unofficial version suggests something more immediate. They met, felt an attraction, and although Babis returned to Athens, his hometown, the two kept in touch. As the summer days passed, their bond grew stronger. By the end of the summer, Babis returned to the island, and the two became romantically involved. Handsome, charming, intelligent Babis swept Caroline off her feet. Later, he would describe her as the most special person he had ever met: a brilliant young woman, wise beyond her years. At just 16, you could talk to her about anything, he said. Her personality was magnetic. She could fill anyone with love. We spent the entire summer together, and by the end of it, it was clear to both of us that we were in a relationship, despite the practical challenges. She was on the island, and I was in Athens. In Athens, the age difference between Caroline and Babis was striking. Caroline was just a child, never having had a boyfriend before, while Babis was a grown man with significant life experience. He had already worked several jobs, had previous relationships, and lived an independent life. Despite these differences, it didn't seem to matter to them. What Caroline knew about Babis was limited. He was attractive, attentive, intelligent, and earned a good living as a helicopter pilot. But for her, the most important thing was that she loved him deeply and dreamed of marrying him, having children together, and building a life as a family. Caroline's parents, however, were deeply concerned. They were completely against the relationship, believing that their daughter was far too young. While Babis had already lived through many stages of adulthood, she still had her whole life ahead of her, and more importantly, she needed to focus on her studies. But Caroline was stubborn. Once she set her mind on something, nothing could deter her. Her parents eventually decided to give her space, hoping that over time, she might lose interest in Babis. After all, she was still doing well in school, never causing trouble, and remaining responsible. They believed that perhaps this relationship was just a passing phase, a summer fling that would fade with time. But to their dismay, the bond between Caroline and Babis only grew stronger. When Caroline finished high school, instead of pursuing her future for her own sake, she chose to attend the University of Piraeus, primarily because it was located in Athens, where Babis lived. Despite her parents' reservations, Caroline was still madly in love, and their concerns went unheard. Then, in 2018, Babis proposed to Caroline, and she eagerly accepted. Once again, her parents tried to intervene, reminding her she was still too young. She wasn't even 18 yet. but their efforts were futile. On July 15, 2019, Caroline married Babis in Portugal. According to reports from Medium.com, her parents weren't even informed of the wedding date. While they knew the couple was engaged, they didn't know when the actual wedding would take place. Some sources suggest that her parents were invited and happily attended the ceremony, while others claim they were left out of the event altogether. Regardless, it was a beautiful, memorable celebration, and shortly after, the newlyweds moved into a house in the upscale suburban area of Glikanira, just outside of Athens. From there, their life seemed perfect. Caroline had it all: a spacious home, a devoted husband, and even adopted 4 cats and a dog named Roxy. She quickly made friends with neighbors, and her pets became a regular sight in and around the neighborhood. It appeared as though Caroline was living an ideal life with her dream partner, but as we know, appearances can be deceiving. 3 weeks after getting married, Caroline became pregnant, but this happiness was short-lived. The young woman suffered a miscarriage, which allegedly changed her completely. According to Babis, her behavior started to alter. Sometimes she was sad, then fine, and other times she had bursts of anger. She would hit him or attack him without any apparent reason, but then she would apologize and seem genuinely sorry. Babis recounted that Caroline became pregnant just a few weeks after their wedding, but unfortunately, when she was 3 months pregnant, she suffered a miscarriage. From that point on, her behavior gradually began to change. The miscarriage, according to him, was the trigger for these behavioral shifts, including aggressive outbursts directed at him. Although Caroline had started therapy, she eventually stopped attending, and one day she simply quit altogether. Over time, Caroline became pregnant again, and this time everything went smoothly. In June 2020, the couple welcomed the birth of their first and only daughter, Lydia. With this great news, they decided to take another step forward and started looking for a bigger house in a better area. Here's an important detail: at that time, Greece was facing a financial crisis, and many people feared losing their savings due to the instability of the banking system. As a result, it was common for people to keep large sums of money at home. Babis and Caroline did the same, with 10,000 euros in cash stored in their house. To pay for the land where they wanted to build their new home, they needed an additional 50,000 euros. So Caroline asked her parent for a loan, which they provided. This information about the money was likely shared with friends and family. On the early morning of Tuesday, May 11, 2021, around 4:30 a.m., 4 masked men broke into the couple's house. One of them stood guard at the door, while the other 3 entered through the basement window. They first tried to force one of the main doors, but when they failed, they broke the basement window and gained access to the house. The family's dog, a 7-month-old puppy, was tragically hanged by its own leash to keep it quiet. The intruders then headed upstairs to the master bedroom, where the attack began. Babis was the first to be assaulted. They dragged him out of bed and took him to another room. Once there, they tied his hands and feet, placed a rope around his neck, taped his mouth shut, and left him in that room. From that point on, chaos ensued. According to Babis, there was screaming everywhere, and Caroline fought back fiercely. She leaped out of bed and attacked one of the men, but he overpowered her and threw her to the floor. Babis noted that these men didn't speak Greek well and had accents that made them sound Albanian. The scene was confusing and terrifying. The attackers demanded Caroline reveal where the money was, threatening to kill their infant daughter if she didn't comply. Desperate to save her child, Caroline told them about the 10,000 euros they had in the house. The men found the money but weren't satisfied. They ransacked the house, stealing more jewelry and valuables worth an additional 20,000 euros. When the ordeal seemed to be over, Babis heard Caroline scream one last time. He tried to free himself to reach her, but the rope around his neck tightened every time he struggled, causing him to faint repeatedly. Eventually, Babis passed out. When he regained consciousness, the house had gone silent. The only sound was their baby, Lydia, babbling nearby. Managing to free himself from the rope, Babis made his way to the master bedroom. Unable to use his hands as they were still bound, he used his nose to dial for help on his cell phone. Despite having his hands tied behind his back and tape over his mouth, he was able to make 2 calls. The first call went to their neighbor, a 48-year-old woman named Lila Gerolem Matu. Caroline was practically best friends with her neighbor Lila. It's not surprising that Babis first called her for help. However, Lila didn't understand what Babis was trying to say and hung up. After another unsuccessful call to her, Babis eventually managed to contact emergency services, all using his nose. By around 6 a.m., the entire street was filled with police cars and ambulances had arrived. The area was cordoned off and officers kicked the door down. Inside they found the scene just as Babis had described. Drawers pulled out, belongings scattered all over the floor, and security cameras disconnected. It clearly looked like a robbery. The police also noted that the family's 4 cats had escaped through the basement window. Their first priority was finding the family. In the master bedroom, they discovered the baby, Lydia, untied and crying on the bed. Next to her was the lifeless body of Caroline. When Babis was brought in, he initially thought Caroline was unconscious or badly injured, but when he was informed that she had died, he went into shock, screaming and crying, before fainting and being rushed to the nearest hospital. With no weapons found in the house and the security cameras disabled, the only evidence the police had to work with was Babis' testimony. Due to the trauma, his memory was unclear. He could only recall that the attackers were Albanian, that there were 3 men, possibly a 4th, waiting outside, and that one had dark skin and wore a black sweater, which was later supposedly found inside the house. Babis also mentioned they had black pistols, but beyond that, he couldn't provide many details. The attack appeared to be highly coordinated and premeditated. The police meticulously collected evidence from every corner of the house, especially from the window the intruders had used to break in. Meanwhile, Caroline's body was transported to the nearest morgue for an autopsy. One crucial detail stood out during the autopsy. Caroline had been wearing a smartwatch. She loved sports and used the device to track her steps, receive WhatsApp messages, and monitor her fitness. She rarely took it off, and this piece of evidence would soon play a key role in the investigation. Forensic examiner removed the watch and handed it over to the police before continuing with the autopsy. According to Babis, there had been a fierce struggle, with Caroline fighting to the end. The assailants allegedly beat her and threw her to the ground repeatedly. However, Caroline's body did not show signs of such a brutal fight. Instead, the autopsy revealed defense marks but no clear evidence of the intense physical confrontation Babis had described. Moreover, the cause of death was determined to be strangulation, and the weapon used was a pillowcase. Experts concluded that her death had been slow, lasting around 6 agonizing minutes. This finding raised several red flags for the investigators. First, in typical home robberies, such a level of violence, especially involving strangulation, is uncommon. Robbers usually target empty homes, and when they do encounter people, they rarely resort to this kind of attack. Secondly, Babis had stated that the assailants were armed with guns, which made it illogical for them to kill someone by strangulation when shooting would be quicker and less risky. Lastly, from a criminal perspective, killing the victims made no sense at all. The robbers had already obtained valuables worth around $30,000, so there was no clear motive for such an intimate and prolonged method of killing, especially with the risk that it might fail, allowing the victim to escape and seek help. Strangulation, as the police noted, is a very personal way to kill, and it seemed out of place for a simple robbery. This crime was so brutal that it captivated the media, with images of the house and interviews with neighbors flooding the news. Babis himself became a central figure in the narrative. The morning after the crime, he gave numerous interviews, often repeating the same sentiment, that no one should ever experience what they went through. He described the night as a nightmare, explaining how they had begged the thieves not to harm them, and had even told them where the money was, hoping they would leave them alone. Babis also expressed confidence that the police would soon catch the criminals. His behavior, however, raised some eyebrows among the investigators. After discovering his wife's death, Babis claimed to have gone into shock, so he was taken to the hospital, where he was given sedatives and examined by a psychologist. Though visibly affected, he was remarkably composed within a few hours, already speaking to the press and calling for justice. The police found his attitude odd, but they reasoned that people cope with trauma differently, and perhaps Babis was simply stronger than he appeared. 3 days later, Caroline was buried in the cemetery of Alonissos. During the funeral, Babis gave a heartfelt speech, and the ceremony was covered extensively by the media. Journalists, police officers, and photographers documented every moment, from the grief-stricken attendees to Babis hugging his mother-in-law. While this was happening, another major development unfolded on the other side of the country. A suspect was arrested. At the border of Greece and Bulgaria, a car was stopped for a routine check. Inside was a 36-year-old Georgian man, and when he handed over his passport, the authorities quickly discovered that it was a forgery. This arrest would later become a key element in the investigation. The man arrested at the Greek-Bulgarian border turned out to be a known criminal linked to multiple robberies, all of which had similar patterns to the one that led to Caroline Crouch's death. In fact, Athens had seen 12 robberies in the last 6 months, 3 of which occurred in Glykinera, the same neighborhood where Caroline lived. One of those robberies was almost identical to the attack that took her life. It seemed as though the police had finally found the perfect suspect. However, upon interrogation, the man provided a solid alibi, proving that he was nowhere near Glykinera at the time of Caroline's murder, and he had no connection to her. This revelation frustrated the police, who then shifted their focus to another potential lead, Albanian gangs. After conducting a thorough investigation, they identified 100 suspects, eventually narrowing the list down to 10 men. Babis was asked to come to the station to identify any of the possible assailants, but he claimed that none of them were involved. The case grew increasingly bizarre, and the public demanded justice, pressuring the police to deliver answers. Meanwhile, Babis was a constant presence in the media, often appearing emotional and tearfully calling for justice for his wife. His persistent media appearances began to raise suspicions. While some thought he was a grieving widower seeking justice, others found it strange that he was so eager to be in front of the cameras rather than staying out of the public eye and letting the police do their work. On June 17, 2021, 37 days after Caroline's tragic death, a memorial ceremony was held in her honor. Once again, Babis gave a heartfelt speech, surrounded by family, friends, and the media. However, this time a detective approached him at the end of the ceremony with surprising news. He asked Babis to come to the station, saying that they had a promising new lead and were convinced that they would finally achieve justice. Babis agreed to go with him. Upon arriving at the station, it became clear that the real suspect was none other than Babis himself. The police presented him with the evidence they had gathered, leaving him speechless. Firstly, they revealed that the neighborhood surrounding his home was full of surveillance cameras, yet none of them captured any suspicious activity at the time of the attack. No cars, no motorcycles, no group of people, nothing. Secondly, despite Babis' claims that the assailants had entered through a window, forensic investigators found no traces of intruders in the house. The window through which they supposedly entered was clean and showed no signs of forced entry. The absence of any physical evidence from strangers, no hair, fingerprints, or fibers was highly suspicious. It became increasingly clear that the story Babis had told might not be the truth. The surveillance cameras in the house were found unhooked and without memory cards. According to Babis, the culprits, meaning the thieves who entered, had disconnected and emptied them. However, the camera records showed something curious. They were active until 1:20 a.m., at which point someone approached, turned them off, and removed the memory cards. It was presumed that these men entered the house at 4 a.m. and hid there for hours, but this time spent doing nothing didn't make sense. According to him, during the attack, there were blows, screams, and the baby crying. The neighbors should have heard something, yet only one neighbor, Lila, noticed something strange, and according to her, it was at 4 a.m., not from 4:30 a.m. onwards when she started hearing murmurs and screams. Within a few minutes, everything went quiet again, which once more didn't add up. The situation regarding Caroline was also problematic. According to Babis, there was a major fight, but her body showed no signs of it. Additionally, she was wearing a smartwatch that recorded her steps, movements, and heart rate. According to the watch, at 3:58 a.m., Caroline was relaxed in her sleep. By 4:05 a.m., her heart rate spiked by 50%, indicating stress, and at 4:11 a.m. her heart stopped. This suggested that Caroline was attacked while she was asleep, implying that the assailant struck her at a moment when she couldn't defend herself. The attack must have occurred while she was completely vulnerable, with the assailant strangling her with a belt, leaving her unable to resist. If that weren't enough, the sixth point was that Babis's phone showed he was never tied up when he should have been. Instead, he moved freely throughout the house. Another interesting detail was that, while it is practically impossible to dial using one's nose, he managed to access multiple apps, called the neighbor twice, dialed a landline number, and ultimately contacted 911. With everything they knew, he had become the prime suspect in Caroline's death, but the motive for the crime was still missing. Friends and family asserted that Caroline wanted to leave him, and her diary confirmed this. In her writings, she revealed that they had constant fights and that they even assaulted each other. After the wedding, Babis had become controlling and abusive. I fought with Babis again, and this time it was for real. I hit him, cursed at him, and he broke the door. All I wanted was for him to ask me how I was doing when I woke up. I felt very weak and tired. I'm considering leaving, but I don't know if I can go with my sister. I love him so much I can't leave him, even though this relationship is hurting me. On the night of the crime, Caroline allegedly booked a hotel room to escape with her daughter, and she expressed this in a message to a friend. She was determined to leave, convinced that there was no way back. In her diary, she confessed that some time ago, she and Babis had seen a psychologist, but the therapy was ineffective and she believed he would never change. The police psychologist noted that in January, Caroline began to suspect her husband might be rekindling a relationship with one of the women he had known before marrying her. She was aware of 2 women from his workplace with whom he had previously been involved. She could no longer tolerate his manipulative behavior. She was living under his absolute control 24/7. She felt trapped in the house, unable to go anywhere without him. Whenever Babis went out, he always took the same cab, which belonged to a friend of his. At that point, Caroline was no longer studying and could not work because Babis forbade it. Whenever he left her alone, she would call a friend who was a taxi driver to come and spy on her. This man would drive by the street, check on the house, and then leave, only to come back later in the taxi. Babis kept her under constant surveillance and Caroline couldn't take it any longer. According to the police, it was clear that she planned to leave with her daughter to escape his control, but he couldn't allow that. That night, he ended her life. The interrogation of Babis lasted approximately 8 hours, during which he confessed. His initial version of events was riddled with lies. He claimed that Caroline lost her temper and announced she was leaving the house with their daughter, stating she would never return. When she struck him, he said he lost control and killed her. Later, he altered his story, asserting that he had the handles in his hands and strangled her in a fit of rage. The police are adamant that Babis killed her while she was sleeping, not when she was attempting to escape or looking for a fight. This part of the story didn't add up, but the next part made sense. Babis killed the dog to prevent it from causing a scene, and then turned everything upside down to simulate a burglary. He organized the scene by breaking the basement window, escaping through the cat flap, killing the dog and rummaging through drawers, scattering everything on the floor. According to him, the scenario fit perfectly, inspired by a robbery that had occurred weeks earlier at a friend's house, supposedly carried out by an Albanian gang. His intention was to mislead the police into thinking that the same gang was responsible for what had happened to them. Unfortunately for him, the plan did not go as he hoped. In 2022, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, along with an additional 10 years for killing the family dog and over 11 years for deceiving the police. Moreover, he was ordered to pay a fine of over $20,000. So now it's your turn. What do you think about the case? Do you believe the sentence was fair? Well guys, that's it for today's video. I hope you found today's video on this very interesting case engaging. If you did, please leave a thumbs up and a comment down below. But before I continue, I have some extra information that many of you might be wondering about. What happened to Lydia after everything that transpired? Initially, custody was awarded to Babis's parents, but Caroline's family obviously disagreed. They began legal proceedings, and for a long time, there was a back and forth regarding custody. After years of fighting and paperwork, custody has finally been granted to Caroline's parents. Little Lydia is currently in Manila, Philippines, with her grandparents and cousins. Next, what happened to Caroline's cats? Caroline had 4 kittens, and it turns out that the neighbor, Lila, adopted them. However, there's some less pleasant news. Babis has a fan club, according to the police. He receives hundreds of letters in prison from fans, primarily women, who claim he is innocent and that Caroline was a bad person. They defend him and deny that he committed the crime. And even if he did, they make excuses for his actions. Some reports suggest that he might have a girlfriend among these fans, and that he is even engaged, but this information hasn't been verified, so I can't confirm it. With that said, here's the question of the day. What do you think about people idolizing killers? See you in the next video. Bye.